Well, hi, everybody. It's David Leis here, your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, our live edition. Every Thursday, we come to you, and we're so grateful for the opportunity to meet today, for everybody's involvement on February the 13th, 2025, the year of our Lord. And isn't that something that it's already February in this new year, and we just every day the news keeps on coming. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those news highlights, and we're going to talk about the eve of Valentine's Day. I wish everybody a very meaningful Valentine's Day with your family, your loved ones, whoever that would be. I know that I am very grateful for my dear wife, Sonia, and so I dedicate this program to our loved ones in our lives. And so let's remember Valentine's Day. And hello, Matthew, and hello to everyone that's coming on board here. We've got a very important program today as we talk about to prorogue or not to prorogue. That is the question as we talk about Parliament. And we've got a lot of work to do in this country. I think that, well, you tell me, but we've got a very close friend and ally, the United States, and we've got a lot of challenges as they kind of reset their relationships. And I know that there's a lot of angst in Canada. Or what do you think? What are your thoughts about Canada these days in our U.S. relationship? It reminds me of the famous Neil Diamond show. I should have almost brought up that background music, Love on the Rocks. As we think about our relationship with our dear friends, the United States. Neil Diamond, I think one of his famous phrases in that song, Love on the Rocks, said, "Yesterday's gone." Well, what do you think? I mean, it's amazing. At some sports events, we even have Canadians, polite, nice Canadians, booing the American national anthem. Wow, gosh, what do you think? Is that the right thing to do? Is that a childish thing to do, or is it the adult thing to do? I know we all love our country. We all are, most of us at least, feel very patriotic about our nation. So what do you think? So that's all very apropos because we've got a lot of work to do. And a lot of people think, including myself, that Parliament should get back to work. And so I'm going to get to our very special guest, John Carpay from the Justice Center, because they're on the forefront of taking legal action to get Parliament back to work. So we're going to take the deep dive on that as we talk about to prorogue or not to prorogue. And it's very interesting. As you know, I'm a student of history. On February the 13th, back in 1689, do you remember William and Mary were proclaimed joint sovereigns of Britain? And I think this is very relevant history. Remember, we need to remember the lessons of history because back then, as I recall, Parliament offered the crown jointly to William and Mary, provided on the condition they accepted the Bill of Rights, which greatly limited royal power and broadened constitutional law. Isn't that something? So you can have the crown, William and Mary, but you've got to rein it in and you've got to have the people's interest at place here. So it's a very interesting lesson of history, William and Mary. So I encourage you to look at that as we think about those traditions in the context of our conversation today. Now, it's interesting. We have a comment from Twisty Hill. I don't think that's a real name, by the way, but it's a name. It says, rude and childish to boo the American anthem, but very patriotic to boo Trudeau. Well, go figure. So thank you for that comment. James Harris says, what part of a leadership race has to do with the business of government? Very interesting question, James. So yeah, no, these are very good comments and questions, and I really do appreciate it. So let's reflect a little bit on some of the headlines. There's so many of them, so I will go through them very quickly. But I believe within the hour, and part of my fortune or misfortune is I monitor the news very carefully because it's good to talk about public policy in today's context, is that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, signs a plan for reciprocal tariffs on U.S. trading partners, ushering in economic uncertainty. Now, I have not read the plan, but I believe that a key principle, if I'm monitoring many of the decision makers around the Trump administration, believe in the principle of reciprocity, tit for tat. If you have, well, let's give an example, a 10% tariff on X, we will reciprocate and have a 10% tariff as well. So no longer will there be tariffs on a one-way street, but they want reciprocity. So that's very interesting. By the way, I also have a comment from Nancy Cartwright. Northern Perspectives Ryan is watching the proceedings and says the argument is being made that the Governor General should be the one held to account for her decision to shut down government. So this is a very interesting point. So as we speak today, John Carpay's team from the Justice Center is making their oral arguments as we speak. So we'll get to that in a moment. We've talked a little bit about the Canada-U.S. relationship and what does this mean as the United States kind of resets. And there's a lot of conversation then about buying made in Canada. So what does that mean if everything is so integrated in our economy? If you buy a vehicle, for instance, we know that vehicles are not only finished in Canada, but many of the parts come from the United States and vice versa. So, gosh, what does it mean to buy Canadian? Are you buying more Canadian products? So there's a lot of people saying Canadian buyers are trying to use their economic power, the power of their pocketbook, to support this country. So let's talk about some other headlines, one of them which is that we know that since those messes have gone out about tariffs, there's been a lot of scurrying about, including the federal government, the prime minister, I believe is in Paris, whereas some premiers have gone to Washington. And in Paris, I think the prime minister is talking about artificial intelligence, of all things, and which is a very important emerging, obviously, technology. But in Washington, the premiers have met with some advisors at the White House, so we will see what's coming out of that. I know that Daniel Smith, the premier of Alberta, has spoken optimistically about that. So let's communicate with our friends and allies. Let's understand their concerns about certainly security and other issues. So there's so many issues we could talk about in terms of the headlines, but I think what I'll do is shift to our special guest, and that is someone who's familiar to you, and that is the president of the Justice Center, John Carpay. So welcome, John. Good to see you.
Glad to be with you, David.
John is coming in from the nation's capital in Ottawa. He's with his team, including the lead lawyer, on challenging the government's decision to prorogue the parliament. So we want to go back to the basics here a little bit, John, and help us understand what was the decision that the prime minister made back in January to, in effect, well, what is proroguing? People get it confused with pierogies. It's not pierogies. It's not something you eat. But what does it mean to prorogue a parliament? And how did that really come about? And of course, then we'll get into the whole question around what's the problem with proroguing our parliament. So, John, help us understand, what does it mean to prorogue a parliament?
Prorogation is kind of a halfway between, if you can picture on one side, you've got dissolving parliament, which means that there's going to be an election. So if the Governor General can dissolve Parliament, say there's no MPs currently, and you go to a new election. On the other side, you could have a recess, and during a recess, there's no question period, but the rest of Parliament does continue. So the committees meet. The committees have the power to summon a minister. A minister can be required to appear before the committee and answer questions about his or her decisions. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why not this? Why not that? Etc. And so there's written questions as well that have to be answered. And so when Parliament is in recess, the only thing that's missing is question period. But for the rest of it, Parliament is still able to hold the government to account. Dissolving, on the opposite end, it shuts down Parliament and it triggers an immediate election. Now, what prorogation is, it's halfway between those two. Prorogation shuts down Parliament, shuts down the committees, makes it impossible for Parliament to hold the government to account, and yet no election is called. And it's not a bad thing in and of itself. What it should be used for appropriately is when the government's legislative assembly agenda, rather, when the government's legislative agenda has come to a natural conclusion. So we've had Parliament in session for, June to September and June to September for 2 years. There was a throne speech at the beginning of the new session of Parliament. The throne speech outlined the government's goals and plans for the next year or 2 years. So prorogation is not wrong in and of itself. It's a legitimate tool. But just to answer your question, so it's kind of halfway. It's like dissolving Parliament, and Parliament is shut down, but no election is called. That's how I would define prorogation.
Okay, so I like the way you put into perspective right from the very beginning that Parliament is the place, literally the people's house, where we are able to hold a government to account. We're able to have some measure, in keeping with good public policy principles, of transparency and accountability. I mean, this is kind of a key spot where we do that and have those committees working away, getting down to brass tacks and what's happening. So proroguing puts that all on pause. And so
11 weeks.
For 11 weeks. So
which is a very long time. There wouldn't be a court case if Parliament was prorogued for a week or 2 or 3, perhaps 4. I don't think any people would kind of say, well, okay, for the government to be not directly accountable to Parliament for 4 weeks is not going to kill us. But 11 weeks is just outrageous for prorogation time period.
Mm-hmm. So we had this parliamentary tool in our long British tradition that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. It's not the first time or probably the last time proroguing will be used. But the point is there's a judgment, there's a tradition on when it's honorable for good reasons to prorogue the Parliament. So it's not like you're against proroguing a Parliament per se. You're saying in this instance, it's wrong. So tell us your case, John, in terms of why your team is arguing as we speak before this federal judge that this is a bad decision.
I was actually watching the live stream federal court proceedings, right until a few minutes ago when I joined you. And with the Prime Minister's own words, because that's all that we have to go on. So he said on January the 6th that Parliament had become dysfunctional. He said Parliament needed a reset, and he said that the Liberal Party needs to have a leadership race. Now, on the first point, Parliament becoming dysfunctional, mostly true, although there was still some business getting done. But the reason Parliament had become dysfunctional is because the Speaker, who is the supreme authority over the House of Commons in terms of procedure and what happens, the Speaker had ordered the government to produce documents that related to it was a federal government grant program for green energy. The specific name escapes me. And there were the Auditor General found that there was the misspending of public funds, and the House of Commons majority passed a motion that the government had to turn over these documents. The government was refusing to do so.
Okay, so just back up for a sec here. This is probably something that many Canadians are not familiar with. Is this the so-called green slush fund, where there's been serious accusations, not accusations, but there appears to be evidence that there's a pot of money that has been going to different places that has really largely been unaccountable? This is a serious scandal. Is this the context now, John, that you're underlining?
Yes. The Green Slush Fund is what the Conservative Party has called it, and I apologize for not knowing the name of the program, but it is. If I want to be nonpartisan, I'll say it's a federal program to give grants to businesses to pursue green energy, to put it in a neutral fashion. Conservatives
Which sounds good. Yeah, in a way. Yeah.
Conservatives say that it turned into a green slush fund. All of that to say that when Prime Minister Trudeau said on January the 6th that Parliament had become dysfunctional, that's technically mostly true. However, he didn't talk about the reason for that. The reason is that the government is refusing an order from the speaker, which they are supposed to comply with, to turn over documents, even without an order from the speaker. I mean, this is about tax dollars. It's not a privacy thing. You know, they're not asking to turn over the home address and medical records of David Leis or John Carpay. This is public funds. So it's a little bit
Wow.
disingenuous to say, well,
Okay.
we need prorogation because Parliament's become dysfunctional, but then conveniently not mention that Parliament has become dysfunctional because the government is not turning over documents about the spending of tax dollars.
Okay. So
So
you're really is if I'm hearing this correctly, all things considered, you're arguing this is an inappropriate use of prorogation
yes,
because Parliament actually was doing its job,
yes,
namely getting at holding the government to account in transparent fashion, trying to get to the bottom of what's going on with like a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. And what was inconvenient to the government, what was dysfunctional to the government, was that they didn't want Parliament to continue because they'd have to answer those questions. Is that the bottom line here, John?
in addition to that, as part of the factual background, the even Jagmeet Singh had joined the other opposition, the other leaders of opposition parties, and it said he would vote down the government at the earliest opportunity.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard he's changed his mind again, but that's not relevant to the court action. But there was a threatened confidence vote that would trigger an election. Now, the other reason Prime Minister Trudeau mentioned is that the Liberal Party needed to have a leadership race, to which we say, well, that's fine. You go ahead and do that. But if having an election right now is inconvenient for the Liberal Party, so be it. We're talking about the Constitution of Canada, and
Mhm.
the heart of this court action. The question we're putting to the court is, should the government be accountable to Parliament? And we
Mhm.
say yes. Or is Parliament simply a tool of the Prime Minister that he can use for his own political advantages? It wasn't quite phrased that way by the lawyers in court, but it really boils down to respecting our Constitution, where, and you know this history very well, there were long fought battles, both violent and nonviolent political battles were fought over the course of centuries to move away from the absolute authority of the king. If you go back to the days of Magna Carta, if the king didn't like you, he could order you to be arrested, jailed, tortured, and executed, because the king's word was the law. And we moved away from that through hard fought struggles over centuries, where the parliament gradually acquired more and more power, and that the king couldn't pass a law unless it was approved by parliament. The king couldn't spend money unless it was approved by parliament. And so we've come to a point, I think we arrived there, 100 years ago, where the parliament exercised the real power. We still had a monarchy, and a lot of people support that, and there's a lot to be said for having a monarchy. But effectively, the king was accountable to parliament. So translated into 2025, what that means is the government, whether it's a minority or majority, the government needs to have the confidence of the House of Commons. The government needs to be held to account by the House of Commons, which is the body of the people. The House of Commons needs to have the right to question ministers, your defense minister, finance minister, energy minister, all the different ministers can be called upon to appear before a committee of MPs and answer questions. And that's so important for accountability. So to shut down Parliament for 11 weeks, we're arguing is an abuse of the Prime Minister's power, and we're asking the court, in this case that's taking place right now in Ottawa today and tomorrow, February 14th, we're asking the court to set aside prorogation, because it was not done in the national interest. It was not done for the benefit of the country. So there's nothing wrong with prorogation, but we're saying in this case, and we're asking the court to outline and clarify what are the powers of the Prime Minister. We've never had a court case like this. The Justice Center is, brings something very new, and it's important to get a court ruling on what are the powers of the Prime Minister, firstly, and then secondly, did Prime Minister Trudeau act within the scope of those powers when he prorogued Parliament on January 6th?
All right, so there you have it. There's a summary from President John Carpay, leader of the Justice Center, as we talk about to prorogue or not to prorogue. They have tabled a legal case that's being heard right now, oral arguments in Ottawa in front of a federal justice. Who is the federal justice, by the way?
Chief Justice Paul Crampton, and he slapped down the federal government's delay tactics. When we first filed this court action, which was on January 7th, it was the day after Parliament was prorogued. The following day, we filed our court papers, and the federal government initially said, well, we don't think this is urgent, but we'll get back to you sometime next week, and we'll let you know our official position as to whether or not this is urgent. And the judge said, oh no, we're going to have a hearing on urgency right away.
Okay, so what is the significance of that, John? I mean, you're a lawyer. What is the significance that that judge dared to hear this case?
Well, I'm not sure, daring, I don't know if it took much courage, but he recognizes, and he might not rule in our favor, but he's been very clear publicly. He released a judgment on a Saturday, which courts rarely do. Saturday, January the 18th at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ottawa time, we got this ruling from the federal court saying this matter is urgent, and you're going to file our side. We filed our briefs on Monday, February 3rd. The government on at the end of the week, and then we are doing the oral argument right now. I would not be surprised if we had a decision as early as middle Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week. We're talking the 18th, 19th, 20th. We're going to get a ruling soon. And the judge just recognized, well, if this is like 99.9% of the other court actions, which take months and years, if we don't get a ruling until April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, it becomes moot. It's no longer relevant. So if we're going to have a court ruling, it should be, if it's released February 18th, it'll have a real impact because it'll put Parliament back into session immediately. And then if MPs choose to do a confidence vote, there'll be an election. If Mr. Singh decides to keep his word from December and not change his mind again, we could be heading into an election by the middle of February. In 10 days' time could be the start of an election with a vote in May, or in March rather. And so he recognizes it's urgent. It doesn't mean he's going to rule in our favor, although I do think we have a very strong case.
All right. So this is a very interesting conversation. As you can see, there's a lot of comments from our audience. And as I'm talking with John Carpay, the president of the Justice Center, it is, I would be remiss if I did not say, well, I'll just say here, Nancy Cartwright says, is the case being directed to both the Prime Minister and the Governor General? And I think what Nancy's getting at is a very interesting question, is the process by which this proroguing happened is technically the Prime Minister has to go to the Governor General and technically ask that the Parliament be paused or prorogued. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it's actually one of the questions that the lawyers are dealing with in court. And the judge has been asking questions of James Manson, who's our lawyer, who's putting forward our arguments today. Tomorrow, Friday, it'll be the government's lawyer that puts forward their arguments. And then we have a short right of reply on Friday afternoon. So we are not saying that the Governor General should disregard or reject the advice given to her by the Prime Minister. Generally speaking, the Governor General accepts the advice of the Prime Minister, and we're not arguing that she should have known better and she should have refused his request and so on and so forth. Some people want that, and maybe in this situation it would have been nice if she had rejected his advice. But then you have to ask yourself the question: do you want an unelected, unaccountable representative of the monarch to be exercising real political power and making real decisions? And maybe the answer is yes. Some people would say yes. But we're not going into that territory. We're not saying that the Governor General screwed up. We are challenging the advice that the Prime Minister gave to the Governor General. So it is directed at, it's not directed at the Prime Minister personally, but it's directed at his advice. And we're saying that the advice that the Prime Minister gave to the Governor General is unlawful.
Okay, so to be clear, the Prime Minister is abusing the prerogative to prorogue the Parliament. And this is what you're challenging, the heart of it. So as I'm talking with John Carpay, this, you can see why this is a kind of a historic moment in this country's history, as this case essentially says, Parliament, get back to work. The context is really quite another historic moment, as Canada is reeling from the implications or possible implications of tariffs from A to Z in terms of our economic future. So we've got a lot of work to do to not only respond to those issues and to be able to have national debates and discussions in the People's House, but also to be able to, frankly, get our policy house in order. We've got, Canada's in a vulnerable situation economically and otherwise. This has been our discussion week after week now. So we need to get back to work and get our country moving again. So I think this is the context, is it not, John, that really underlines the urgency of getting Parliament back to work?
Well, the other interesting thing is that some of the measures that the government has announced to deal with the situation, if we're going to spend, 100 million or some other amount on increased border security or cracking down on fentanyl, or even retaliating with our own tariffs on American goods, a lot of these actions actually require Parliament to amend legislation, or at least some of them do. And so there's a practical thing too. You can announce, oh yeah, we're gonna create a fentanyl czar whose job is going to be to, crack down on fentanyl, and we're going to give this new position a budget. Well, you do need parliamentary approval to actually implement that, and until that happens, prime ministers can give speeches and announce their intentions, but you need Parliament back in session to pass the laws and allocate the money to turn that into a practical effect. So that's another very relevant reason why Parliament should go back to work and be able to do its job of holding the government to account, especially at a time like this. If this was a lazy, happy summer, but there's no need to prorogue. I mean, there could have been a recess. If Mr. Trudeau really felt that Parliament needed a reset so that the temperatures could cool down, Parliament could have been put into recess, and then you would still have all of the committees functioning and being able to question ministers.
Indeed. Well, we've got a lot of comments, and we certainly appreciate them. Please like this conversation, share it with Canadians. It seems to me that too often, I had just been speaking with a friend, Lieutenant General Michel Maisonneuve. He's retired, but I mean, he would say so many Canadians are just too complacent. We're great people, but we've got to know about this issue to understand its significance and how this is really, in many respects, undermining the ability of Canadian democracy to function. If you can't have discussion and open debate, that's a huge problem. So please share this conversation, like it. This is very, very important. So let's get to some comments here. James Harris says Trudeau was supposed to work for the country. Yeah, so this is a great comment, James, is that, again, getting Parliament back to work. Brian Watson says, James, I heard that, but big deal. They're getting paid I'm just trying to read this. I think I can. I'm not sure if I can read that fully there, but the point is they're there to at least work 5 days a week. Good comment. Jerry Price says, would the Constitution need to be changed to fix this in the future, John? What do you hope to really get out of this lawsuit other than to get Parliament back to work? Is there a larger strategic outcome that you'd like to see happen?
Well, constitutional change is incredibly difficult, next to impossible to implement, because if you wanted to, let's say you wanted to add property rights to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which I think would be a great thing. But if you want to change the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you need support from the Parliament and 7 provincial legislatures, which together with the 7 of them have at least half of the Canadian population. So try getting a majority in the House of Commons and then majorities in 7 provincial legislatures to agree on something. So it's next to impossible. It's possible, but it's almost impossible. So constitutional change is not really on the table practically. So this court action would be like other court actions where we seek to have the government respect the Constitution, and so we look to the court when the government is not respecting the Constitution, whether it's the charter freedoms of religion, conscience, expression, association, peaceful assembly, or whether it's, in this case, it doesn't involve the charter at all, but it does involve the Constitution. Can the Prime Minister use prorogation as a tool, and is the Parliament kind of a servant of the Prime Minister? To which we say no. And I'd like to respond very briefly when James complains. I think it was James, complains about Trudeau. It's really easy to fixate anger and even hatred on Trudeau, but I think we have to recognize what's going on with Canadian culture, political culture, and just culture generally, our attitudes, our beliefs, our habits. What's going on with Canadian culture, where Trudeau gets a majority and then wins 2 more elections with minority governments. It's so easy to point the fingers at Trudeau. It is so easy, but I think we have to ask the harder question: why are so many people voting for Trudeau, and what's going on with their culture that we get that kind of an outcome?
Well, wait a sec, John. You're challenging us as Canadians.
Yeah.
We have met the enemy, and it is us.
Yeah, we've met the enemy.
Yeah,
There's
okay.
a bit of a victim. There's a very dangerous victim mentality where you go, "Oh, we're a victim of the school board because the school board is harming children by promoting transgender ideology, and we're a victim of the provincial government because they're doing this and that wrong, and we're a victim of Trudeau because we don't agree with his policies." No, as long as you keep on whining like a victim, you're not going to get off your duff and do what it takes to effectuate the change. If you don't like your elected school board trustees because they're harming children with transgender ideology, then roll up your sleeves, get to work, and vote them out of office. And you might fail the first time. The first time you try, you might fall flat on your face, but you learn how to run a good campaign by doing it, by campaigning. That's how it's like playing piano. How do you get better? By playing piano. So how do you get better at winning a school board trustee election? You get better by participating in the process. And you might lose the first time, but then 3 years later, you go back at it. You're more experienced. You've got a better campaign strategy. You've raised more money. You've got better literature. You've got better voter outreach, and you'll get it next time. But the worst thing you can do is complain as though you and your children are a victim of the school board. As long as you see yourself as a victim, you're not going to be making the change.
Okay, but no, that is a fair challenge. It's interesting. There was a comment earlier by Linda Bishop, who said mainstream media changes the narrative and people believe it. And I think this is something worth underlining. It certainly from my vantage point, and I know that, John, we've talked about this many times, is that in Canada, something very unusual has happened the last several years, where the federal government is funding some 2,000, not just 1 or 2, but 2,000 media outlets. And they all have to get on board with an agreement to cover certain issues like diversity, equity, inclusion, quote, reconciliation, climate change, or quote, climate hysteria, really all government kind of messages. And I think this has done great harm to the body politic, so to speak, the larger information of the Canadian people to understand what's going on. I think a lot of Canadians are concerned. They love this country, but darn it, it's hard to get good information these days if frankly, a lot of the media are paid off by the federal government. I mean, we need a independent strong media that speaks truth to power. I mean, we talk about the importance of Parliament as a place to talk about accountability and transparency. It's the same thing with the media, and they have done a brilliant job paying off the media. Am I being too crass about this, John?
You're not being too crass, but what you're saying is it's incomplete. There's another part of the story which is so encouraging, which is that every day there are fewer and fewer Canadians that are listening to government-funded media, of which the CBC is only one example. The CBC gets 100% of its funding from government,
Yes.
but other media outlets, radio stations, televisions, newspapers get government funding as well. So fewer and fewer Canadians are listening. They are slowly dying a well-deserved death as more and more people are tuning out and just not listening. Anybody that needs to go to the government begging for money is in a losing business or a losing industry. And so they prove that by taking the money. Now, the good news is we've got independent media outlets, including The Rebel, True North, Epoch Times, Western Standard, Blacklock's Reporter, the Counter Signal, and then we've got organizations like the Frontier Center and the Justice Center and the Fraser
Hmm.
Institute and many
Hmm.
others that are educating Canadians about politics and
Hmm.
economics. So what we have to do proactively is dig into our pockets and pay $10 a month or $6 or
Hmm.
$8 a month and subscribe to independent media like True North and the Rebel, the Epoch Times, and so on. And
Hmm.
that's how we're going to turn things around. So yeah, the situation is bleak and abysmal. There's been, I think, abandonment of media are supposed to be truth-loving, truth-seeking, and truth-telling, and they've lost that integrity. They have become paid apologists for a government narrative. We saw it with false claims made by media, not just every day, but every hour of every day, of every week, of every month for years on end. The media were peddling a false narrative about
Hmm.
COVID by
Hmm.
vastly exaggerating how much of a threat it was and
Hmm.
creating unwarranted fear. And it's sad, but we just dig into our pockets and give money to the independent media, and that's the solution.
Okay, so well said. So let us join hands together and recognize this. So critical thinking is so important, and also the need to. I mean, there's green shoots of hope here. I mean, it's just amazing. I look at even this program; our numbers have just skyrocketed over the last 2 years, and we're just really grateful for the audience. So please share it, like it, subscribe to the Frontier newsletter while you're at it. Um, so I would be remiss on this February 13th if I didn't mention February 14th. Not only is it Valentine's Day, John, uh, but it's also the anniversary of the invocation of what was called, oh, yes, the Emergency Measures Act. So, how does this anniversary of that Emergencies Measures Act fit into all of this? Is this just yet another stunning example where government is abusing its power and overreach? I mean, I know that decision was overthrown, but the federal government, almost before the paint dried on the decision by Judge Mosley, is appealing the decision within minutes. So link it up with that issue, John.
Well, after the federal government used the Emergencies Act to inflict violence on peaceful protesters, and admittedly they were inconveniencing some people in Ottawa, not everybody. They were probably breaking provincial laws and municipal laws, and the authorities did not address that by issuing lots of tickets and calling in the tow trucks. And I can appreciate, I lived in Ottawa for a year and a half, about 20, 30 years ago, but obviously the local residents didn't appreciate the length of the protest. However, it was entirely peaceful. We did not have arson and violence and property damage and threats of
Mhm.
violence, et cetera, et cetera. So the Justice Center provided lawyers to 4 Canadians to take the federal government to court, and we were successful. And so in January 2024, almost 2 years after Freedom Convoy itself, sadly, that's how long court actions take. We got a court ruling from federal court Justice Mosley, and he said that the federal government acted illegally by not complying with the requirements. You can only declare a national emergency if other means of law enforcement cannot address the problem. That's one criterion, and there's a whole bunch of other criterion, and the government did not meet the criteria. So the government has now appealed that. They had oral argument last week, and I'm not making any predictions, but I'd say the initial decision was very strong, and I think the federal government faces an uphill fight. What's really frightening is Mark Carney, who's running for Liberal leader, reportedly, it's a media report, take it with a grain of salt, but reportedly he said that he wants to accelerate federal funding for infrastructure projects or something, accelerate the development of something or other. It was economic, and that he would use the Emergencies Act to accelerate economic policy. That is creepy. That, you know, the Emergencies Act, what it should be used for is if let's say there's a terrorist plot of, you know, is there some group and they've got an agenda and they've got a plan and they don't want to use the democratic process. You've got a terrorist plot and they have cells all over the place. They're on the verge of toppling the government, or you've got, you know, a violent insurrection, and you like it's really for a really extreme situation. That's why we have the law. In certain very extreme circumstances, the government can say, okay, it's a national emergency, and they take very aggressive measures, and that can be okay, it can be good, it can be necessary. But here, to hear somebody say we could invoke a national emergency so that the government can accelerate federal spending, or it's not supposed to be a tool for economic policy, and that's incredibly frightening.
Indeed.
To hear anybody say that.
I want to thank you, John, for citing that. We have a clip here that I would like to share, so you hear it from the horse's mouth as we look at one of the candidates for the Liberal Party is Mark Carney.
Corridor. A lot of it is going to be housing, the 3 or 4 million new homes that we need across this country. And something that my government is going to do is to use all of the powers of the federal government, including the emergency powers of the federal government, to accelerate the major projects that we need in order to build this economy and take on the Americans.
So there you go.
Emergency powers to accelerate major projects. That is appalling. I mean, that is on level with fascists and communists and Nazis. It is comparable to that, to disregard Parliament. Parliament controls spending. The Parliament can pass a budget, and I wouldn't agree with this as a wise course of action, but speaking legally, Parliament can pass a budget and say we're going to push the country another, you know, $100 billion further into debt, so that we can just build, you know, whatever houses and railways, this, that, and the other thing. Parliament has the power to do that. It might be wise or unwise. To say that he would use emergency powers, and then to see people kind of going, "Oh, okay," it's like this is. I'm not exaggerating with my comparisons. This is a dictatorial, fascist, no respect for Parliament, no respect for democracy. If you're talking about using emergency powers for economic policy, that is completely outside of what the Emergencies Act authorizes.
Right on. So you're seeing the bigger picture, how we have these very important traditions that came through many years of literally not only sweat but blood to be able to ensure that there are intelligent, rational checks on power so that the people have a voice. And if you have this kind of attitude that says, well, by golly, we'll do this and that, and we'll just simply invoke emergency powers to do what we want, this is a very worrisome proclivity to authoritarianism. I think that's your point, is it not, John?
Yeah. Stated another way, Parliament's business is to make life difficult for the government. Not difficult to the point where government can get nothing done, but
Mhm.
difficult in that there's always this check on power. The government is accountable to Parliament. Parliament's elected by the people, and the MPs can hold the government to account and effectively make life difficult for the government. Now, of course, Parliament should be fair and just in how it goes about that, and should not, just be a pest for the sake of being annoying.
Mhm.
Not
Of
in that
course.
sense,
Yes.
but checks on power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts
Mhm.
absolutely. If Parliament is castrated and the government can do whatever it wants, then we're no longer in a democracy.
That's right. And this is why the leader of the opposition is introduced as Her Majesty, or sorry, His Majesty's loyal opposition. To be loyal is to critique, to offer constructive criticism in the tradition of healthy debate. This is how we arrive at truth. This is how we arrive at some measure of accountability. And we don't give up these traditions lightly. They are to be taken really as sacred obligations to each other, to every citizen of our country. So that is my speech for the day. We've got a lot of other questions here. Um, D ski jokes, give me liberty, us, or give me meth. I think that's a tongue-in-cheek missive of some famous quotes there. The previous, Weechie says, the previous federal government was rigged and is being investigated. The last 5 years should be. Well, it's a good question because we've also had the tabling um, the week before prior of the foreign interference report by the commissioner, Hogue, and I did have the occasion to read the report. I thought it was very interesting where that investigation showed that there was nothing, quote, treasonous that met the high criminal bar, which is not a surprise. But it was very clear that within that report, the government got its narrative that somehow there was not, there wasn't major foreign interference, which I think is actually really not accurate from my perspective. And I think this is the point, though, because that report should be debated now in Parliament. It should be pursued. These are vital issues. Like, not only do we have the world of a new administration in the United States, not only do we have the need to rebuild public policy in Canada to move our productivity up so that we're not $40,000 less money for every family in Canada than our American counterparts, but we are also discussing foreign interference. There's a lot of business to do, isn't there, John, when it comes to the Parliament? Not to mention the so-called Green Fund that is just sitting there, and the questions remain unanswered.
Well, the report on foreign interference does not tell us which MPs or other government officials were involved in it or impacted by it or
Mhm.
touched by it or coerced, pressured, threatened, or deliberately participated. It doesn't say who did it, and it doesn't say what was done or where or why. So a good report would go much further and say it was the honorable member for Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, or the honorable member
Mhm.
for
Yes.
Surrey South that was meeting with Chinese government officials or
As a
whatever.
hypothetical, yes.
We need we need the details in that. In terms of election fraud, I want to respond to that. If we want more trust in our election process, we need to use paper ballots that are counted on the same day that they were cast, counted at the same location, with an opportunity for candidates or their representatives to be present for the counting. If you have that in place, it becomes very difficult to have voter fraud.
Okay, so just
Converse,
let's
if
don't bury the headline there, John. So you're saying that we've still introduced a place where you can vote without a paper ballot?
Well, what
That's
I'm
what was
saying is
happening, right?
you've got this electronic voting now, and so at the end of the day, you don't have hard copy paper ballots for a recount.
Yeah.
Um, there was a by-election for Calgary Catholic School Board trustee, and the winning candidate won by 32 votes. I don't know if second place finisher is asking for a recount or
Mhm.
not, But a lot of elections are close. If you want to do a recount, if you've got paper ballots, you go back and you look at the same paper ballots, and the candidates can have their representatives there, and they're counted at the same time. If you have those basic provisions, it's a lot easier to cheat when you have mail-in ballots and when you
Indeed.
have these
Yes.
electronic voting machines or touch the screen. Well, then only somebody who is an expert in software and computer technology could try to go back and try to verify it. Whereas with paper ballots, everybody of sound mind, everybody can see. We can recount the paper ballots. You don't need to be a whiz kid with computer technology to be able to go back at it.
Exactly. So let's get back to the basics when it comes to election methodology. You have paper ballots and you count the votes up the same day and you announce the winner, the results the same day. I mean, this is crazy land. Instead, there's always this tactical effort to make it not just voting day, but voting week or voting month. We'll keep on voting until the right side wins. I mean, this is absurd. James Harris says what the new government needs to do is to rebuild trust. This means some people need to see jail. Wow. Well, maybe that's the case. And I guess what James you're getting at is well said is we need accountability. That's how our institutions have been structured over trial and error over time. And I think that's the point is that it's like our institutions that have developed over many, many years have an accumulated wisdom, a practice that ensures accountability. And what you're doing is you're seeing those institutions compromised. And that's why you're going to court, isn't it, John?
Well, we're doing our part. But look, the battle for the free society, for a strong and free and democratic Canada, it's got to be fought on multiple fronts. It's kind of like a war, you've got your Air Force and your Navy and your Army and other methods. So we need to fight the battles on the education front, improving the education at the elementary and high school and university levels, so kids start learning history again, so that little Johnny doesn't get told by his teacher that he might be a girl and he could become a girl if he wants to. We really need drastic improvements to the school system. That's one front. The other front is the media, where our side is slowly winning because less and less people are listening to the CBC. More and more people are tuning into the Rebel and the Epoch Times and so on. We need to fight it in the courts, and that's where the Justice Center comes in. We're active there to hold the government to account in court, and then politically and electorally. Politicians are mostly followers, not leaders. If politicians sense that Canadian people really cherish our freedoms of speech, religion, conscience, and others, if that's clear, politicians will follow suit. And so we need to fight peacefully on all of these fronts so that we can win the war.
Absolutely. We've got a lot of comments here. I'd love to see the Canadian government. This is Cat in the Hat. I'd love to see the Canadian government, e.g. the political members, including the Prime Minister, are involved in the fentanyl crisis, be indicted and sent, I think it says sent to jail, perhaps. I mean, I guess the point is, again, accountability. We've got issues when it comes to drugs in this country. There's no question about that. As the fentanyl lab in, I believe it was Kelowna, I think it's the world's largest fentanyl lab, was discovered. So something is going on in this country, and we need to get on top of it. Shelley says they need to get back to Parliament weeks ago. This is not what Canada voted for. I think that's a very good point, is that surely all Canadians want their Parliament to be hard at work. Canadians work hard every day, and they're struggling under concerns regarding increased prices. If you just go to the grocery store, you see that everywhere you go. Why would our parliamentarians not serve the people by getting back to work? Ed Smith says, get back to work and name the traitors they called, and call a federal election immediately. Well said. Now, there was a question earlier. Pardon me. Sharon says Canadians are not being heard. Well said. Um, there's just a lot of great comments here. We really appreciate that from the audience. So please share our conversation. So Michael Stewart has an interesting question. If the judge agrees that the prime minister used his power illegally, what repercussions would Trudeau face after the fact? Any comment, John?
Yeah, James Harris also asked, what are the repercussions for the prime minister? The short answer is that, look, with the Emergencies Act, the legislation does not call for the punishment of the prime minister or cabinet ministers if later on a court rules that it was not truly a national emergency. Some people would say that doesn't go far enough, but I think it is good that the Emergencies Act itself has a mechanism that actually requires a review. But we took the government to court. We won. We got a ruling that the prime minister acted illegally. There's not. It's a little bit different from your typical criminal law case where somebody violates the criminal code, and then if it's shoplifting, you're not going to go to jail, but you get some punishment. You get a criminal record, or if it's murder and you're found guilty, you're going to spend time in jail. In terms of the long-term accountability, the democratic process does provide for it. You see Justin Trudeau having announced that he will not be leading his party into the next election. So there's accountability. You might say it's too late or not strong enough, but the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And there's an old French proverb you've probably heard before: if you don't do politics, then politics will be done unto you. And I think the problem in Canada is that in the last 50 years, possibly longer, there are good, truth-loving, justice-loving, freedom-loving people who have abstained from the political process and say, no, I'm too busy, I'm not interested, it's dirty, it's slimy, I'm not going to get involved. When you take that attitude, you open the door wide for people who might not love truth, justice, and freedom as much as you do. And if you leave the door wide open for them to rule unopposed, you're going to get tyranny. So we all need to roll up our sleeves, be more active at the federal, provincial, municipal, and school board levels, and be active in the democratic process.
Right on. So let us be active as citizens. And I think that's a very powerful insight. If we're not involved, then there are others that are just happy to use that vacuum of leadership to their advantage, to manipulate you, to be able to, frankly, use power to their advantage to be serving themselves. So good point, John. I think the other question I would have in this context, John, is, are you concerned, though, that by making this legal challenge, that ironically we put more power in the hands of a judge? I know there's pardon the pun, a judgment call on this issue, but, part of the brilliance of the parliamentary system is that, we have these honorable traditions. So there's a high level of trust that the decision makers are ultimately going to govern in the interests of the people, in line with those traditions that say that proroguing the parliament will be not misused. But now we ironically are finding ourselves, instead of going to the governor general with good advice, we're going to a judge. And I don't know about you, but I have a lot of major concerns about some of the quality decisions coming out of, none other than the Supreme Court of Canada. I mean, I think some of the comments made by our sitting head judge with the Supreme Court have been atrocious. And I guess what I'm saying is, should we not be, are you concerned that this will just potentially put more power in the hands of unelected officials, namely judges?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Canada needs better judges. As we've seen, I've outlined this in my book, Corrupted by Fear. I have read cases where judgments simply repeat. They hear a media narrative and they write the media narrative into their court rulings as not supported by evidence before the court. Yes. And they make false assertions in their court judgments that are simply repeating what the judge heard on the 6 o'clock news. That's a very serious problem. And so we do need better judges. On this case of the prorogation of Parliament, the courts have a legitimate role to determine constitutional questions. The constitutional question in this case is, what is the scope of the Prime Minister's power? Does it include the right to prorogue Parliament on a whim or for political purposes, or are there certain boundaries within which the Prime Minister needs to operate? And then a secondary question, once we've established that, what are the boundaries of when Prime Minister can prorogue Parliament or not? Second question is, did Prime Minister Trudeau act within those boundaries? So we really need a court for this. Now, you mentioned the Governor General, and I go back to this issue that we discussed earlier. Yes, you could make the argument, and there's some merit to it, that the Governor General should be exercising some real power and saying to the Prime Minister, nope, you don't have a good reason to prorogue Parliament, I refuse your request. But then that leads to the other question, do we want unelected, unaccountable representative of the monarch to be exercising real political power? Some would say yes. I'd probably be with those saying, no, I like the monarch as a representative of the people, a representative of the tradition, representative of democracy. It's been said that when the Prime Minister bows his head to the King, the Prime Minister is bowing his head to all of us. So I'm not against the monarchy, but I would be reluctant to give real political power to the Governor General. I wouldn't favor that.
All right. Well, we've had quite an extensive conversation today with President John Carpay with the Justice Center. Literally, as I believe the opening comments have been put into recess now, as we hear the case in Ottawa before a federal judge. And I just am so glad for this discussion and the many comments from the audience. It's interesting. Earlier, I think there was a comment by Scott who said, "Let us put honor back into the honorable members of Parliament." And I think that's a very good point, is that we need to look not only at our members of Parliament, but also as Canadians, how we involve as citizens. I think that's been a point that you've made many times, John. Well, this is a historic time in our country, and so we'll wait with bated breath in many respects for the outcome of this decision. When did you say you thought there might even be a decision made? I know that you don't have a crystal ball, John, but what's your speculation on that?
I will speculate that Chief Justice Paul Crampton of the federal court is very interested and very motivated to get a decision out the door as soon as possible. I would not be surprised. I'm not making a prediction, but I would say I would not be surprised if he releases ruling on Tuesday the 18th, Wednesday the 19th, Thursday the 20th, Friday the 21st of February. It would not surprise me at all. I think it's highly likely we're going to get a decision very soon. And we have a very strong case. I would not be surprised if we were successful, but I'm not making any predictions.
All right. So we will wait and see. And thank you for all the kind comments. Donnie says, cheers, gents. Fingers crossed Canada will win this fight. And thank you very much for all the marvelous comments from the audience and affirmations. We really do appreciate it here. I did want to remind people that we have this conversation on the live every week. We also, I wanted to just highlight as well that your comments do make a difference in terms of not only our discussion, as you can see, but also in terms of sharing this near and far. We are just so delighted with the program. And I wanted to announce today and highlight it for you that the program is actually going broader across the country from coast to coast on what is called Merit TV. This is in partnership with Dr. Phil's Merit TV in the United States as well. You can find it on Bell MTS Fiber in Manitoba and also Ontario East, as well as the Bell MTS satellite at number 657, and of course Rogers Cable, both on Western and Western networks, and of course on TELUS as well. So we're really excited to reach a much, much larger audience. In fact, in November alone, we had 3.77 million audience interactions in the month of November on social media alone. So we're really excited about this as we try to share the information regarding what's going on in this country. We think that's a critical condition, a foundational condition for our country. So we care as well, to Sharon Hildebrand. So well said. So that brings to a close our conversation today with John Carpay, President of the Justice Center. Thank you very much, John, and the audience, and thank you for you and your team for challenging this situation to prorogue or not to prorogue. And we wish you every success. And thank you, John, for joining us.
Thanks for having me on your show. It's an honor.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.